everyone. Thank you for staying with me, because I know that as you head toward the end of the day, kind of people depart. So thanks for being here. All right, so Bennett took some of my slides, so he stole some of the thunder in the last session, but that's okay. I'll walk you through everything that we are going to talk about now. For those of you who don't know Forrester, it's a technology research company. We do advisory, consulting, surveys, a lot of market research, some of which you will see here today. So originally, I was planning on showing our 5-year forecasts, and we basically had to throw all those out the window over the last few weeks. So I don't have a lot of forecasting data, but I do think that it is important to just sort of set the kind of the 30,000-foot view of what's happening. So consumer sentiment is not in a good place right now. When we go back and look decades, there are only a handful of times that it has been as low as it is now. And when we talk about things that are even beyond issues related to consumer sentiment, like the state of the world, that's not necessarily in a good place either. I don't know if you know what the doomsday clock is, but it is basically it's an estimate of how close we are to a man-made extinction event, basically. And this is something that Nobel Prize winners, this dates back to like Oppenheimer and Einstein have put together. We are at the closest to extinction that we have been pretty much since the atomic bomb was actually dropped. So not a good thing, and it is related to things beyond just tariffs. I mean, it really is about AI and climate change and nuclear weapons and so on. This is the slide. So we also have, in addition even to tariffs affecting supply chain, we have things that we have barely talked about in the media, like the fact that the Suez Canal is still not taking ships. So you have, kind of a major supply chain route going around the southern part of Africa, which not only increases prices, which is what Lenovo talked about earlier today, but of course also adds further uncertainty to when things are even going to arrive, where they're going to arrive. Now, all of that said, we have seen and observed so much cognitive dissonance over the last several years, and that continues to be the case now, that in spite of all the craziness, retail sales are still going up. And even in spite of inflation, which is what the yellow numbers are, they continue to be much better than they were decades ago. And the same also applies to e-commerce, which continues to take share. We're now at like 20% of all of retail sales happening through e-commerce. So what I'm going to talk you through is what's going on in the world. And there are a handful of kind of themes in this agenda. This is an AI-generated image, by the way. This was DeepSeek. So it looks like their training data, when I put in retail chaos, was like Pacific Palisades. So that's what we have there. So I'm going to start with what is going on with the Trump teas, I call them, because there's more than just tariffs. But we're going to start with tariffs. And I don't know, so it is shocking to me that this is like not something that is like the foundational basis for all discussions. There is so much uncertainty around what is happening. There's a lot of random speculation, and things, of course, are changing on a daily basis. And there's also this sense of this is entirely like a chaotic mess, which it is, but it's rooted in something called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is, it's not actually a thing. It's basically the kind of the nickname for this paper. And the reason that this paper is so important is that it was written by perhaps the most important economist that you've not heard of. And his name is Stephen Moran, and he is the current chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So he is one of the top economists in the Trump administration, not one of the ones you typically see, kind of in the media. I don't know why. I don't know if that's by design or incidental. The only time that I've really even heard him talk publicly was like to some crypto bro podcast, like before before he was even sworn in. But he talks about this, and I encourage everyone to, if you have some time, like maybe later this week or this weekend, to read it, because it is really, really important and foundational and gives an explanation, at least from an economic standpoint, of what's happening. But I'm also going to save you a little bit of time because I'm going to just summarize it in like a couple of minutes. And this is really the heart of why we are seeing what we are seeing with tariffs, which is it goes back to the belief that the US dollar is actually too strong. Now that's kind of crazy because most of our lifetimes, we've wanted a strong dollar, right? Like we've lived under a strong dollar policy, kind of economic scenario. But the fact that the dollar is too strong basically means that there is inelastic demand for the dollar. No matter what, people want the dollar as the reserve currency. And as a result of that, that has led to all sorts of economic distress, particularly in middle America, where you don't have any demand for a lot of the goods that we produce. So that's how manufacturing was essentially decimated. And the other part is that we are, as a result of, kind of post-World War II, where we're such a big part of the kind of the policemen of the world, we've subsidized everyone else's military and their global security. Now, the strong dollar was awesome when the United States was so far ahead of everyone else. But now, as other countries, in particular China, have caught up, this strong dollar policy is not that attractive anymore. So that's really the heart of what is driving a lot of, kind of this very, very different approach to an economic policy. So what's the plan to solve this problem? And the overarching goals are really on the right-hand side of the slide. And I think that these are pretty unassailable bipartisan goals that every American really is probably behind. It's about, relieving the U.S. deficit. We have a huge deficit. We're spending a third of our budget on both the military and our interest payments. That is the part that everybody recognizes is not sustainable. We want to grow the U.S. economy, get that positive GDP. We want to preserve U.S. hegemony, and we want better border security. Now, this is the next step, which is where all the arrows come in, which is where things diverge. And people have different opinions as to, well, how do you achieve all of these things? And are these goals even, kind of encompassing the things that we know are issues with the US economy, like healthcare or education, none of which are, kind of on the right side of the slide. But what we get to is essentially, we want to really, kind of how do we get to reducing that U.S. deficit? How do we get to growing the economy? And this is where it comes down to reducing our tax burdens and basically asking other countries to step up and do something for the United States. And that is where tariffs come in. But the challenge, and there's actually more to this whole thing, because in addition to the Mar-a-Lago Accord, there are a lot of executive orders that have been placed too, which also include things like a sovereign wealth fund to help all of this. And we're not even going to get into that because that's really, complex. But basically, this is where the tariff discussion comes, kind of to fray. Now, there's also this notion that we're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And the myth there is that it's not all manufacturing. I mean, I keep hearing about, kind of people being like, oh, we're going to bring T-shirts and widgets back. I mean, I can't even see how that would happen. And I agree with you because that's not really part of the discussion. Even in looking at the executive orders, it's about higher value manufacturing. And this would be sort of like the poster child of what that would be, is like take something like NVIDIA and having them bring some of their manufacturing back, or some of the things that are really high value. They're talking about anything that is highly technical or defense related, really, is where that manufacturing is. Now, the challenge with all of that is that, of course, there is so much political blowback, and you've read about it, you've seen it. There are the lawsuits from the Republicans suing the Republicans. I mean, imagine, kind of that's actually, we're in that world. But the truth about the tariffs, and this is where it comes back to, kind of what is the end game here, which is that literally no one in the world thinks that this is a good idea, including the economists, many of the economists in Trump's own administration. And that's really what the red line is like, every line is like a different organization, some of which are lean left, some of which lean right, some of which are international, and everyone is in the red that this is not going to be positive for the US GDP. And this, by the way, is with relatively conservative assumptions. This doesn't even assume like the 100+% tariffs that now are being proposed on China, because it would be even worse. So in that world, what is the purpose here? The purpose is not that these are necessarily going to be long-term tariffs, but it's basically to back countries, other countries against a wall and shake them down so that we can get to, kind of either more of those payments in some way, shape, or form. Like I said, like whether it's some companies bringing some manufacturing to the US or reducing their own tariffs, or another thing that is in the Mar-a-Lago Accord is getting them to trade their bonds for, kind of essentially their T-bills for 100-year bonds at 0% in exchange for some military protection. So that's really the guts, is that this is all about ultimately, kind of doing more for the US eventually. Now, in spite of all of the political blowback, the question is, well, how much longer is this going to continue? And what I would say is that there is one ace that the administration has in its back pocket right now, which is, interestingly, that popular support is actually pretty high. Because when you look at how popular the Trump administration is now versus exactly the same time in 2017, it is higher. And we don't, I think that for those of us who follow CNBC or, kind of whatever news source, it doesn't seem that way, but it actually is. And so long as those numbers are better than they were in 2017, there is still a bit of runway to continue to essentially play chicken in all of these tariff scenarios. So that's the situation there. And I think a large part of the reason that we see the divergence in how is it that some people can kind of be so supportive of tariffs when seemingly, kind of all of the economists say that it isn't such a good thing, it really comes down to the fact that, kind of we're so filtered in the information that we receive. So anyway, net is that even Stephen Moran, who wrote the paper proposing the tariffs in the first place, was really about using these as a tool of leverage in order to ultimately get U.S. monetary, essentially the currency to where we need it. And it gets very, very complex because tariffs in the short term actually would make your dollar stronger, not weaker, but it's all about the end game. So just remember that. Now, I'm switching to TikTok, the second of the Trump teas, which is that TikTok has had an unmistakable, enormous impact on not just our behavior as shoppers, but on search. And this is, I think, one of the biggest changes that we are going to see in e-commerce probably over the next several years, which is when we look at the percent of people, especially Gen Z, that uses TikTok as a search engine, it's pretty astounding. It's like nearly 2/3 of people. And they're using it for a lot of these product-related issues. Now, part of the reason that TikTok has grown in search is because Google has essentially flailed. And if you think that Google search is worse, you are correct. It is worse because this academic paper from Germany actually shows how bad Google search has become for a number of reasons, not unrelated to the amount of junk that's online. And even when we look at other sources of search, like for instance LLMs, they are substantially better, like Perplexity. Did I skip a page? Now the issue with a lot of these LLMs is that it still remains to be seen whether or not they will actually have much of a long-term impact, in large part because right now they're relatively unconstrained without the copyright kind of issues going into their training data. But there are certainly movements and policies in place that are attempting to try to limit what can be used as their training data. I thought this was an interesting one. It's actually an organization called Created by Humans, which was started by one of the founders of Y Combinator. So you actually have forces in Silicon Valley that are now pushing to force some sort of copyright protection around this training data, which I think would definitely not only make LLMs more expensive, but may limit their, the trajectory of their growth. Then there are other reasons for that too. But what we see here is that when we look at either search or shopping-related search, there are now more alternatives that are there. And it is everything from Amazon to the LLMs like ChatGPT. And I always get asked about Perplexity, so I put that number in there. It is, I love Perplexity, but it's a small single-digit %. And the other thing to remember is that if TikTok were to go away, look at where Instagram actually is. Instagram right now, we're not talking about Instagram as much as a search engine, but it is used as a search engine, even for shopping search, by a lot of people. So if TikTok were to go away, who would be the winner? According to this, it's going to be Amazon and Meta. And that's really what, kind of Google is trying valiantly to, kind of get ahead of, but not only is their content, but the algorithm isn't necessarily as sticky. Temu is also, that 2025 number should be 0. But basically, Temu, I talked extensively about Temu last year, and my opinion has not changed. I don't think that it is long for this world, and we are now getting toward all of those things like de minimis exceptions going away. And if there was any indication that they themselves are not super bullish on their future, I would say that the lack of Super Bowl ads is there. So that brings me to the fourth T, which is talent. And this is one that isn't talked about as much, but is actually really important for those of us in e-commerce because our IT organizations have a lot of H-1B workers. And there are bipartisan efforts to try to shut that down because there is a belief that these people are taking jobs away from other Americans and that they are suppressing wages. But what I will share with you here is Exhibit A, which is that Asian STEM workers actually get paid more, not less. So this argument that they're suppressing wages, I think, is somewhat specious. But where the problem really is, and this is a list of some of the top companies that have the highest number of H-1B workers. But let's take an example of a company like Infosys, which has about 7,000 H-1Bs here in the United States. The previous slide showed that they're generally pretty well-paid and highly educated people. The issue isn't with the 7,000. The issue is with the 300,000 workers overseas in regions like India that Infosys has that are getting paid less than the American software developers. But that is not part of the discussion. But we won't say that because, kind of all of this it's probably in the benefit of of all of our IT organizations that things are kept as the status quo. And it looks like it may very well be, but it is something to just keep in mind. Okay, second big area of discussion here is retail, AI, which has been a huge part of retail forever. And we talked about it extensively last year as well. And I'm going to revisit this framework because I don't think that it has changed substantially, which is we have AI, and then you have generative AI, which is a subset of everything that could be characterized as AI. And we've spent a lot of time focused on it over the last couple of years. And with about almost 30 months to show for it, almost 2.5 years, this is essentially what the kind of the use cases have been. And I apologize that the font is a little small, but I'm happy to share these slides with you if anybody wants it after. But basically, it comes down to 3 key Gen AI use cases that large organizations have generally found. One, and we've talked about it a lot over the course of today, is content generation. That can be anything from taxonomy for search results to kind of marketing collateral that can be created on demand. There's a lot of workforce augmentation to put kind of natural language and queries for internal chatbots and being able to kind of have different systems talk to each other. And then, of course, there's the customer experience, which is the consumer-facing chatbots. Now, there are some other elements too, like, for instance, IT with kind of code generation. What I will say is that in all of these cases, they are useful, but incremental. Like, even in the case of like IT code generation, Walmart has said that it generates like maybe 1% lift in the productivity of their IT team. Now, that is great. I would take a 1% lift over a 1% decline, but it's not necessary. It's incremental, not transformational. And that brings us to the next big thing within AI that we hear talked about all the time now, which is agentic. And this is even just in the last 18 months or so, the explosion in the interest in agentic versus kind of the interest in generative. Now, what does agentic actually mean? And it can get very complicated, but kind of at the guts of it, agentic AI in general is something that is essentially very autonomous. There's a goal, and there is a machine or a bot or some sort of a set of algorithms in the background that are acting on their own for that end. So a driverless car, as an example, would probably be a great example of ultimately what is agentic AI. Amazon's merchandising system, which is generally hands-free, especially for its 3P sellers, I would also argue is agentic AI. Now, the issue is that in retail, most people are not that interested in agentic. Now, there are exceptions, like, for instance, particularly in fraud detection and in anything in payments, like, there is absolute comfort with that. But for anything that involves you, like, giving dollars or having, like, serious HR repercussions, in general, agentic is not something that anybody wants. They want some sort of human in the middle. And that brings us to what I would characterize as earlier stage, kind of phogentic solutions. They're either robotic process automation or AI-powered automation, which, by the way, today there were so many great examples that people talked about, whether it is in, kind of how you kind of think about your marketing programs or, kind of creative programs, where there's a human in the middle, but yet there are easier ways that you can multiply the amount of creative that you've developed, or you're thinking about, kind of new scenarios for financial planning, or, kind of even thinking about pricing and having dynamic pricing. All of those things are just, kind of a few of the examples here. But what I will say is that even though it's not officially agentic AI, some of the biggest value is going to come from these phogentic solutions. We can call it whatever we want, but the truth is that there is a lot that is still very manual in retail, and there is an opportunity to leverage automation to make things faster, quicker, and more efficient, especially in this period of great economic uncertainty. So don't dismiss it just because, kind of it's not officially, kind of real AI. Now, what I will also say is don't, kind of be careful with what is characterized and kind of just be careful about taking agentic literally. Like, I don't know if you guys saw this. This is just a funny story that, well, it's not super funny, not for the guy who's going to go to jail, but what it is that, so there was this app called Nate, which is a universal shopping cart, or was a universal shopping cart. And, we've all talked about universal shopping carts for like 20 years. And these guys would promise that, you can put all these different retail items from different stores and, AI will buy it for you and ship it to you. And it turned out it wasn't actually AI. It was like a call center in the Philippines that was doing it. So the guy is now, kind of going to, he's in the middle of a criminal lawsuit. So anyway, so just be careful about over-promising on what AI is. If he had just said that this is just, kind of a universal shopping cart that's manually done, he probably wouldn't have got the valuation that he did, but it would have been a more honest characterization. And that brings me to where we are now with respect to trust. And we are in a place where there have been so many bad actors with respect to AI in particular, and the federal government has been relatively incompetent in creating any type of regulation and frameworks around it, that we see individual states in our beautiful system of federalism stepping up and creating regulation. And that regulation is everything from, laws against deepfakes to forcing transparency anytime there is AI, whether it's in a chatbot or HR systems or, kind of even in personalization online, so that the consumer, kind of knows that something may be AI generated. And in fact, this is something that there are a lot of organizations that think that, in addition to the doomsday clock, that think this is one of the most pressing problems in the world. I don't know if anybody's heard of this nonprofit called 80,000 Hours, and they basically want people to get jobs and things that are more meaningful. And their big thing is like, go get a job trying to figure out how to regulate AI. But what I will say is that a lot of our lack of trust in institutions, whether it's through filter bubbles or some of the abuse of AI systems, this has led to so few people believing in major institutions, whether it's our government or whether it is business leaders or whether it's the media. And part of that, and part and parcel, is also the growth of cyber criminals and cybercrime. Cybercrime, globally, is estimated to be, or will be, in 2025, nearly $10 billion. And that encompasses, of course, a lot of things, including fraud. And of all of the things that business leaders say they will continue to invest in, even through recessions and downturns, is, of course, things to protect their business against these cyber threats, and particularly against fraud. I will also say that I've looked at a lot of annual reports over the years, and in particular looking at risk factors. And one of the things, and generally, I don't know if you guys know this, but when companies list their risk factors, it is generally, not always, but generally listed in order of importance. So the ranking of what you see is generally like the things that are the biggest threats to one's risk. And the mentions of cyber threats and fraud have increased gradually over time. So since I'm here at a Signified conference, I thought that would make sense to share. All right, so I want to kind of wrap up this presentation with a couple of thoughts on, very specifically, other themes that are helping conversion rates and kind of supporting e-commerce overall. And this is really about the shifts in mobile commerce. And we've talked about m-commerce and the phone forever. But what I will also point out, and this is something that we started to see last year, which is that more than half of commerce is now transacted on mobile devices. That continues to go up, but the challenge is that conversion on mobile devices is abysmal, and most companies have not revisited their mobile commerce experience pretty much since like 2010. Because remember, the iPhone was released in 2007, and then it was like everyone jumped onto the app bandwagon, and for the most part, a lot of companies didn't really find value from that because very few companies get enough repeat visitation over the course of a year that it justifies it. So you saw a lot of companies abandoning their apps, but it was probably a little too early, because when you go back to what's the scenario now, it is not only worth revisiting, and I'm not saying that, kind of necessarily the calculus for an app would make sense or not, but even looking at mobile UI and whether or not you have a seamless experience without a lot of friction is crucial. And what I will also point out is this is some data from Forrester on something we call our Customer Experience Index, and it's looking overall at how people are able to achieve their goals in a retail setting. And it is it is not a coincidence that when you look at the years of the pandemic, or around the pandemic, and especially when people were working from home and were more likely to be accessing content on big screens, not small screens, that the CX index scores went up. And then as people go back to their small screens, kind of that customer experience goes down. So there's a very, logical connection between if you're happier with your experience, you're more likely to convert, and if you're not, you won't. And that, of course, really begs the question of, are you doing everything you can for that mobile experience and not letting people fall through the cracks when they're accessing your content on small devices? Now, I will also point out that there are a number of interesting shopping apps that could also be worth considering, not just shopping, but just in general, some mobile commerce, mobile touch points that are emerging and growing, and could also be some of the ways that you can think about reaching shoppers on mobile devices. So from a shopping standpoint, there are live shopping apps like Whatnot that claim to be like finally the killer live shopping app that will kind of be the mother of all live shopping in the United States. It's sort of like, kind of QVC on your smartphone. And I think actually QVC has a deal with these guys now. Like to Know, which is also an app that has been around for a while, but also it's about supporting influencers on mobile devices and really enabling people to shop through an influencer-led channel. And then also there are new social media apps altogether, like No Place, which at least for a period of time was growing with Gen Z consumers. But as we know, a lot of these social apps come and go, and we don't know if it's going to be the next Clubhouse or whether it'll be the next kind of TikTok, TBD. I'll also look at kind of how retailers are implementing some of this content on their own sites. And one of the most interesting things that I saw recently was actually on Nordstrom's site, where on a lot of their new arrivals pages, they have video content that's created by some of their store associates actually sort of talking through an individual item. And the interesting thing about this is that it is all through like a vertical video, and the idea is, for the most part, that it is just showcased on the product detail page, but you can envision a world where ultimately all of this content gets pulled together onto some of these mobile app pages, like for instance on a Whatnot or even a TikTok if it lasts. Another thing that could also be worth watching is how augmented reality and new devices like the Meta glasses could potentially also catalyze how consumers access content and how they search for content. Now remember, when you put all of this stuff together, that Instagram is now search, and you have a relatively successful new form factor in the form of these glasses. This, by the way, was what Google Glass always wanted to be, and Meta with a sub $500 price point, and actually pretty decent style. Remember, the whole issue was that they would call the Google Glass like the glass holes, because kind of they were really annoying and ugly. But these are actually pretty attractive, and they can be customized, and kind of will eventually go even into kind of eye doctor offices. So this is something to consider as potentially even the next iteration of where m-commerce goes. So last, I want to talk about conversion, and this comes down to a lot of our post-transaction issues, because we've spent some time today, and this is definitely something that's likely on many of your minds, is this tension in the returns world. Because on the one hand, the shopper wants easy returns, but on the other hand, they also want it in really expensive ways. Like they want those instant refunds, or they want kind of prepaid shipping and all sorts of things that are going to make it much, much more expensive for retailers. And what is also true is that we all want to personalize, but at the same time, personalization has this tension where you have about a third of people who are all in and are happy to provide that value exchange where you give me something and I will share my data and everything that you need to know about me, or you want to know about me. But then you also have a larger percent of people, the 42% of people, who don't want a personalized experience explicitly, or they say they don't kind of want you to take any of that information, or they're not willing to make that value exchange. Now, does that mean that you can't personalize to that group at all? No, of course not, because this is where some of this implicit hidden personalization comes in, and it isn't necessarily about marketing, because marketing is what is on the right-hand side of the slide. Kind of the other part is really about things like, for instance, if you want to provide a better returns experience without having the, kind of the blanket instant refund, kind of 365-day returns, the very, very generous policies that have been put out there, that is where the options are. Now, the trend seems to be to actually make returns less easy. When we ask shoppers, kind of, are you noticing these things, either in shipping or in returns, which are in the red, are you noticing that they're made more expensive in some way, or they're less convenient, or your guarantees are limited? And in fact, for younger consumers, they're actually noticing this even more. But this is where, and this likely, kind of if it's less convenient, this is also going to lead to a lower conversion rate. But the question is, well, how can you still have your cake and eat it too? And that's where the idea of being able to pinpoint, hand pick, kind of those shoppers that you want to provide the better offers to becomes so much more compelling and so much more valuable. And you've probably seen and noticed, and you probably have experienced it yourself, Amazon's Just Keep It returns approach, where they've now even extended it to 3P sellers. Now, this is something that really, really needs a lot of math and algorithms behind it, because otherwise it's so easy to potentially lose your shirt on this. But it is because of them knowing and being able to infer based on both the margin of the product as well as the propensity of the shopper themselves to have returned something fraudulently, or have kind of the likelihood of that shopper to repeat and to kind of ask for the next refund, kind of it all comes together. And we heard this earlier in the panel with Wayfair and Rainbow about exactly, kind of the idea of bringing greater science and being more selective about who gets what return. And that's where this idea of that non-obvious personalization. So there are ways that you can address even those consumers who are in the 42% who may not say that they explicitly like personalization, but nonetheless, you're giving them special benefits, kind of as a result of who they are, and or you are if you know that they are likely to yield that higher lifetime value for the benefit of your business. So I promised 25 things. Here were they, and I don't know if you saw like the little Easter eggs. They were little, kind of yellow boxes or yellow squares through everything. So I did have 25 as I'd promised. But that was the summary. Now, the good news in all of this is that even though this is a time of tremendous uncertainty, we have seen this movie before. And we saw it just a few years ago, and I think so many of the lessons from then about things like cash conservation and automation and kind of focusing on those things that really matter to your shoppers are so important, and these are lessons that are as true now as they were back then. So here's what I would say to do as next steps, and I think that these are all generally very, very doable. If you're unhappy about tariffs, just learn about lobbying. Clearly, a lot of the, kind of the sentiment of the business community has had an impact on ultimately, kind of a lot of the seesawing of back and forth with respect to the tariffs. So just get involved with lobbying and get involved with organizations, whether it's RELA or NRF, to work with them to have your voice heard, or the Chamber of Commerce if you happen to be a smaller business. And this is something that, kind of I talk about government, and I feel like, kind of I'm talking to a broken record because everybody in retail is like, oh gosh, that's not my thing. But it's like we all became like nurses during COVID. We can expand and do things that are outside of, kind of our kind of technical job descriptions. And this is something that is clearly going to impact a lot of us, likely, because this is a topic that won't go away. I mean, this is something that we should have a voice in. And by the way, another thing is that you can't just attach like a tariff fee to your customer invoices, because that subjects you potentially to junk fee lawsuits. So just know that you're actually going to have to, kind of, if you are one of those companies that from the last panel, you have to raise your prices, there are going to be some people that aren't going to be happy with it, and you need to explain it somehow, but you can't do it by just calling it a tariff fee. Now is absolutely a time to experiment with creativity, and every company has a long list of to-dos, of things that you wanted to get to, and you probably faced all sorts of departments of no over the last few years because there was always other priorities, or, kind of others didn't want to invest the effort in trying something new. So now is actually a good time to potentially try those new things. We saw this happening in 2020, and I feel like now is a redux of the same level of uncertainty and this desperation to try to bump up sales in whatever way you can. Relook at your mobile experiences and just make sure that things are not falling through the cracks, because I certainly notice that whenever I'm shopping on a mobile device, I like to go and prefer to complete the transaction on a larger desktop, and probably a lot of your shoppers are doing the same. So are you doing what you can to make sure that, that you're not losing that sale entirely? Test new tools, like whether it is something like a Whatnot or, kind of whatever latest, shopping effort that even Meta has, or Amazon, but at the same time, you want to diversify and experiment with as many of these players as possible, because you don't want to be too dependent on a single third-party platform. You want to continue to own as much of your 1P data as you can, but at the same time, you don't want to leave kind of some great new channel that could explode overnight. Kind of that's something that is I think only common sense. And then the last is that you want to review your personalization program and see the benefits of any type of non-obvious personalization. You can't just be focusing on marketing-driven personalization. That's the great thing about this audience, is that you guys are kind of very, very focused on operations, and you're focused on the things that kind of can really drive benefit from a P&L standpoint. point. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. And I know that there was a lot of small font through this presentation. So if you want these slides, just ping me. It's first initial, last name @Forrester. So thank you.
All right, everybody. Let's give her a big round of applause. Sucharita, thank you.